So I bought these HDMI cables, and the reason for buying them was I was having some issues with the DisplayPort HDMI connection to these big TVs. So I've been through a few HDMI cables. So I'm sitting there on the sim, installed this new HDMI cable, and I'm flying around, you know, it's been 30-45 minutes maybe. Bring the plane back in, I land, and then as soon as I touch down with the plane, I start to smell this like burning rubber, burning plastic, or electrical smell. And for a minute I'm trying to work out where it's coming from. Cannot work it out. So I jump off the cockpit, and immediately as I get up and kind of like walk out that way, like I can really smell it. And so I turn around and look, and I can see just a little bit of like smoke, which almost looked like vapor, just start to come off the collar of the HDMI cable. Man, did I myself. So please, if you buy new HDMI cables, expensive, cheap, something in the middle, just test it out. You know, give it a good half hour, 45 minutes in the sim, test it out, and then check the heat that it's generating in the back. Now, I don't know how this happened, I don't know why it happened. Maybe somebody can dive into the comments there with their suggestions of what might have went wrong there. But it's so important just to check that stuff out, especially on those cheap Amazon HDMI cables. Now, we will get into that later. We're in Papua New Guinea right now, and we're going to chat about all things displays. And we're sitting in a small airstrip called Buzilman. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but we're sitting around 5,000 feet, and we're going to fly down into Google airstrip down at 2,200 feet, which is an extremely tricky landing. So whether we make that or not, I don't know. Alright, here we go. We need full prop. We're going to pump up the RPM before I release the park brake. Park brake's off. Here we go. This is going to be tricky. And oh, we're up. Alright, let's just get up. We'll get this plane turned around and on course, and then we will have a chat about monitors, common mistakes. I'm going to go through a lot of the questions, and quite importantly I think is I want to go through the downsides to a large display like this, because yeah, it looks cool, but sometimes it can be a bit of a pain in the arse. Now, you might see the odd stutter on here because I am recording using Streamlabs at the same time as running these three displays and these two here. So one of the most common mistakes I see is picking the wrong size or resolution of monitor. Flight simulators can be really hard to run. You know, there's a lot of pixels to push, and the software is pretty heavy on the graphics card. Personally, I think that if you're running 32-inch monitors and below, there's no need to go above 1440p. There really isn't. It's all about pixel density at the end of the day, obviously depending how far you are from the screen. And I always tend to think about, when you're picking screens or a screen size, think about where you want your simulator to be in the next 3 to 5 years, as you can easily outgrow, or a monitor will easily last 2 to 3 graphics card upgrades along the way. So I always start with the monitors and then work back the way. The second thing we'll briefly talk about is cheap HDMI cables. Now, I've had nothing but issues with cheap HDMI cables. I don't know how many cables I went through to get this system up and running, but I just always had issues with them. And when you do come to actually purchase them, make sure they're running HDMI 2.1 or DisplayPort 1.4. This is just going to future-proof you a little bit. You know, you'll be able to run those higher resolutions down the line when you do upgrade your graphics card. And if you do have to use converters like I've got, and I'll put a link to in the description to the ones I have, if you do have to use converters, make sure that the match the specs of your HDMI cable or your DisplayPort cable, meaning that they can still feed through like a 120 Hz 4K signal, for example. So just make sure those two things actually match. The third is buying an OLED TV. OLED TVs are great, primarily for the black levels you're going to get out of it. The picture quality is insane, but at the moment they suffer from a thing called burn-in. Now it's when you leave, say, a graphic on the screen in the same place for a longer period of time, those pixels can actually burn in and cause a ghosting on the screen, which just completely ruins your screen. Now some of the more expensive panels do have a thing called, I think it's called pixel shift technology or something like that, to avoid the burn-in. But these panels are typically more expensive, so if you are going to go OLED, just be cautious with that. I will link in the description to an OLED panel I recently flew with that does have that pixel shift technology, and you know, the picture quality was absolutely insane. I'll link that in the description. Now for some of the more common questions I get, and one of the biggest ones is which size of TV I should get. Well, you can see here the size of monitor that I'm running, and there's a specific reason for that. I wanted to feel like I was inside the cockpit. I wanted a life size or a 1-to-1 feeling while I sit in the seat. Now it can look a bit weird from that rear camera, just because of the focal length. It can make things appear a little bit larger than they are. However, when I sit here, I'm just going to back the speed off a little bit. When I sit here, it feels right, and these are triple 55s. So as long as you get your zoom level right, you know, it's, for me anyway, that's it. It's great. To recreate a setup like this, look, you don't need to go 55 inches. I have used triple 42s before, slightly on the smaller side, but it does still work. You don't have to go all the way up to 55. And I have jumped on a triple 65 inch before. Now, I personally thought it was a little bit too large. I've never felt the need to go larger with my monitors. So for me, the sweet spot is that 55 inch. Track IR and Tobii Eye Tracker also actually work well with a 55 inch screen. If you've got a single screen, it's a good way to go. It does mention in the Tobii Eye Tracker website, I think there's a maximum screen size of like 32, but I actually found it worked with the 55 inch. So if creating that life-size feeling isn't important to you, there's absolutely nothing wrong with running any size of screen. Apart from super ultra wides, I don't think are great flight simulator displays. You know, the 21 by 9 ultra wides can work quite well if you have them mounted just above a set of G1000s. But I really think depth in the screen is quite important when you're talking about a flight simulator display. LED, QLED or OLED. Well, for me, the best panel right now, budget and quality wise, is the QLED. So it kind of sits in between that LED and OLED. Reasons for that is you get good brightness, you get fairly good colour. The viewing angles on these new televisions are really quite good. And the black levels, look, they're nowhere near OLED black levels, but you know, they are good enough. HDR, should I get a television with HDR or a monitor with HDR? I don't really bother with HDR all that much. I don't feel like it's very well implemented. The manufacturers, you know, a lot of it's just marketing. You know, a lot of these televisions and monitors that have got the HDR badge on them are not true HDR. If you want to get a true HDR monitor or television, look for the 10-bit panel. Now that should say that in the description. It has to be a 10-bit panel, and it should have an HDR10 certified logo on it. Anything less than that is kind of just a gimmick. As far as my experience goes, it really just doesn't work that well. So refresh rates. Most monitors or televisions will run 60 Hz refresh rate. Now this is absolutely fine for flight simulation. As you can see here, we're actually quite slow moving, as most of flight simulation is. Don't get sucked in for buying some sort of crazy gaming monitor with 144 Hz refresh rate. You're just spending extra that you probably don't need. And even at the moment, the way graphics cards are. Certainly in my system here, you know, I'm getting these are 120 Hz monitors and I'm getting nowhere near 120 frames per second. You're probably looking more like 45 at the moment, in and around there. The only time I would maybe recommend a monitor with a higher refresh rate would be for combat flight sims, because they do generally move a little faster. You might get your money's worth if you're playing a lot of combat flight sims. Do I need VRR? And VRR, that's variable refresh rate. This can help stop screen tearing and stuttering and whatnot. I would say yes and no. One of the more annoying things about VRR, or coming from the manufacturer's side, is that the VRR only works within a certain range. So let's say you've got a 60 Hz monitor. That VRR range might only work between 48 Hz and 60 Hz. You're not getting the full range. Unless you're playing in around that area, then yeah, VRR can be quite handy. If you're confident you can get a flush 60 frames a second and you've got a 60 Hz monitor, it's not really something that you're going to need. It is helpful for me running the triple 4K 55s, because I often will bounce in and around that area, but it's not an essential thing. Ultra wide or 16:9, now I did speak about that earlier. Personally, I don't think there's enough depth in an ultra wide monitor. I really don't. I would prefer a large 16:9 with an eye tracker over an ultra wide monitor any day of the week. And again, the 21:9 ones are a little bit better. It's those super ultra wide monitors that I just don't think they're good for flight simulation. Triple or single screens? The triple screens for me, they give me that much more of a feeling of like being in the cockpit, being able to look over to the side to spot landings and runways. You just get a, you get a good sense of position. Great for VFR flying. Like, you cannot beat triple monitors for VFR flying. In fact, I think that's definitely where they're the most strongest. So a few things to watch out for. HDR. And like we spoke about before, HDR can be a sneaky marketing tactic. Unless it says HDR10 and you double that up with the fact that in the description it's got a 10-bit panel, then you know you're getting proper HDR. Now, if anybody thinks any different or knows any different, jump into the comments and let me know. Then the smooth motion rate. You see this all the time. Smooth motion rate of 160, smooth motion rate of 200. Just bin it. It's not even a thing to consider. It's another one of these marketing things they try and throw at you. If you are buying a large monitor, try and check it out in the store, get up close to it and check the viewing angles, because the closer you get to a monitor, the more that viewing angle increases, and the edges can start to almost wash out a little bit. So it's fairly important to do that. I'd always recommend jumping into the store and actually checking it out for yourself. And another thing about checking a large monitor out in the store is the glossiness. So you don't want something that's too glossy and reflective, because what can happen is the center screen and side screens can reflect off of each other. I do get a bit of reflection on this. I mean, it's really not much, but if you're looking for it, you can notice it. And again, I'm going to say it again, but check those HDMI cables. So the downsides of a setup like this, I mean, you'll probably look at some of my videos, you'll see me harping on about it all the time, how great they are, and they are great, but it does come with a few downsides. I think the main one is heat. Often I've got to have the air conditioning running in this garage where I've got all this set up, because there's heat coming from every side now. Now the heat actually increases if I put these panels on like 120 Hz, for instance. They're pumping out more heat. Now there's heat pumping out the back, there's heat coming from the glass on the front. So there's definitely something to consider, is the heat. Sometimes all three displays don't connect properly. Now I have no idea why this happens. I've got an order for turning things on. I go from right to left. I turn each monitor on. Once I see them come on, I'll turn the computer on, and I would say about 95% of the time it's perfect. That other 5% of the time, like one of the monitors isn't displaying anything, I have to do a restart and then you know, they all come on after a single restart. Don't know why that happens, but it does. That's just a little bit of a headache. It's hard on the graphics card. So I'm running a 4080 graphics card. I'm running NVIDIA DLSS. I think it's on performance mode at the moment. You know, I'm getting about 40-45 frames per second depending on where to fly, and the settings I have set, I think they're medium to low. I mean, it's still good enough for flight sim. It's still amazing, but you do have to run your settings a little bit lower. I'm always having to adjust and align the monitors. Now, this isn't because they move on their own, but I'm always in and out. I'm changing things around the back. I'm fixing things. I'm moving pieces of equipment in and out of the simulator. So inevitably, you know, they get nudged and pushed, and they're always just, I'm constantly having to make minor adjustments to realign them, which can be quite frustrating. And turning them on one by one, although I'll get used to it now, but it just used to really piss me off. Now, I bought 3 of the same televisions with the idea that I would have one remote and I could just click it once and they would all just like turn on. Not how it went down. So I've ended up ditching the remote controls because sometimes the remote would turn 2 on, sometimes it would turn 1 off or 2 off. It was just getting confusing, so I have to manually turn them on and off underneath each monitor. Not a big deal, but a bit of a pain in the arse. So I'm going to leave some recommendations for screens that I've personally used that I know work quite well in the description, as well as probably a couple of HDMI cables that I know work, and more importantly the DisplayPort to HDMI converter that I currently use. Now, none of this means it's going to work perfect in your system. I can only give you the recommendations based on how my system works. Anyhow, I'll stick that in the description. And I think it's now about time to see if we can pull this plane down and get it landed on this runway. Okay, we're going to follow this little river around, and it breaks off to the left up here, and that should reveal the runway. Now, unfortunately, I am getting a little bit of stutter. I think just because I'm recording at the same time here. We do have a little 3 knot wind from 220. Could be on the tail. I think it's going to be a tailwind as we come in. Not enough though to upset what we're trying to do. So we're sitting at 110 knots right now. I am going to go 10 degrees flaps. Alright, now we're hovering around 18 knots. So I'm just going to try and maintain that speed, especially as we come around this corner. We are moving around a little bit. And there she is. Okay. 20 degrees flaps. There seems to be a building right in the middle of that runway. We're going to have to be off to the side. .35 degrees flaps, so we're on full flaps now. Yeah, that building is on the runway, 500 feet. Yep, a little bit, but it's got a 3 knot tailwind. So it's looking alright. There's a little bit steep towards the end there. I still managed to get that 200 feet per minute, which isn't too bad.